right, guys, so we are in lesson number 5. This is over Numbers chapter 20, which is titled Lack of Trust, which you'll see kind of that repetitive lack of trust all the way from Numbers 11, kind of culminating in Numbers 20. And what I mean by that is the Israelites kind of go through this cycle of rebellion and lack of trust in God, all the way from Numbers 11, whenever they start heading towards the promised land, to the rebellion and banned to the wilderness in Numbers 13, to the revolt of Korah in 16, and then we get all the way to 20 here. So it starts with the Israelites, works its way up to the leaders, to the priest, and now to Moses and Aaron, their 2 leaders, right? So this is just another sad chapter, honestly. There hasn't been a lot of good that's happened from Numbers 13 when the spies came back to all the way now. We start in verse 2, but in verse 1 you'll notice that we're back to the land of Kadesh in the first month. And it mentions the first month because we are starting that last year of wandering. There's some time markers at the end of chapter 20 with Aaron's death, and then later chapters that shows you that you're in the last year of wandering. So a new generation's cropping up here. Miriam has passed away in the land of Kadesh, and now they're back to where they started here, and we might see a reoccurring action and reaction. So verses 2 here, there's no water for the community, and they assemble against Moses and Aaron. You should automatically think about, not only have we thought about Numbers 13, but now Exodus 17, where they didn't have any water on the other side of Mount Sinai. That was just a few months into the first year in the wilderness. Now we're just a month into the last year in the wilderness. So we've got some parallels here with Exodus 17 and Numbers 20 here. The people quarreled with Moses, and I think that's significant here. Moses here over the probably the last few decades have quarreled with this people, the old generation and now the new generation, and it seems like the new generation has the same spirit as the old generation here. So they're going against Moses here, questioning his leadership. Obviously, Aaron has had his leadership questioned in the couple chapters before this. And they say some pretty outlandish things, which I think is interesting whenever you're in a difficult situation here. But whenever you can't find water in a desert, things are just going to get worse from there, right? So they're saying, if only we had died with our brothers. Probably talking about Korah and that revolt. Why have you brought us out in the wilderness to die, right? Why have you led us from Egypt out here to this evil place? They're always looking back to Egypt. They're always looking back to their past bondage for some reason. And it's always when they don't have a specific thing. When they didn't have food back in Numbers 11, they talked about all the fish they had, back in Egypt. Now they're talking about they can't find water. Why did you take us out of Egypt? They're always fantasizing and romanticizing their past, right? And they're not looking at the God that they have now, the God that's been with them this whole time. So naturally, and later on in verse 5, you can see they talk about grain, figs, vine, and pomegranates. These were things that the spies brought back from the land of Canaan. So again, they're looking at what they don't have, and they don't remember the promises and the faithfulness of God, who's protected them and provided for them in the wilderness for the last 40 years. The manna, the clothes, the protection. So I think that's just a good remembrance for us to remember that God has promised throughout the Bible to always be with us through our problems, through our issues, and once we have a problem that comes up, remember that God is always with us. So Moses and Aaron goes to the tabernacle and they go face down. They go face down in a posture that speaks to the Lord. He comes down and he gives them a simple task here. Take the staff, assemble the community, and speak to the rock. Okay? Again, this mimics what happens in Exodus 17 here. But a simple task. So Moses and Aaron leave. They grab the staff from the presence of the Lord as he commanded. That's in verse 9. And then they summon the people before the rock. And this is where things go south. Okay? So we are in verse number 10. This is where the sin of Moses comes into play, really. So he says, "Listen, you rebels." must we bring water out of this rock for you? So, on the one hand, Moses and Aaron was summoned to speak, but not speak to the rock, and they certainly weren't said to lecture and criticize the people of God, right? Calling them you rebels, and right now Moses is in the middle of rebelling against God, technically. And then he attributes this miracle, this promise from God that water will come out, to Moses and Aaron. He's saying, must we bring water out of this rock? So you can sense a little bit of pride and anger out of Moses right now. You know, he's followed the will of God in Exodus and Leviticus, and now you can notice that, again, this cycle of sin and rebellion is starting to crack here in chapter 20. So after he speaks here, he then raises his hand and strikes the rock twice. Again, he was not said to do anything with the rod but grab it and really just to hold it. So he's acting against the will of God and doing what he's not supposed to do. So water gushed out abundantly. The community and the livestock drank. And if you stopped right there, you would think that even though someone failed, God still is merciful and faithful, and yet that's what happened here. But no sin goes unpunished, right? There's no partiality with God. You would think here that God would pardon Moses and Aaron for such a small infraction as striking a rock out of anger versus just speaking to it. But there's more than just meets the eye here, right? Yes, Moses was disobedient. But you must remember, Moses is the leader of Israel. He is held to a high standard, right? And you can kind of see the heart of Moses here with anger and bitterness towards the people of God here, and also the belief or the trust that he didn't have in God by not doing the simple instruction that God gave him. He felt that he needed to lecture. He felt that he needed to call out the people for the sin in their lives, and in reality, he's the one that's sinning. He's the one that's misrepresenting the people to God and misrepresenting God to the people here. So, because they didn't trust in God and they didn't demonstrate God's holiness in the sight of Israel, they are disqualified from going to the land. So I've kind of wrestled with this over the years, but I think the fact that Moses is the leader, you know, the friend of God who talks to him face to face, the most faithful on the earth, right? The one that God used for delivering Israel out of Egypt. He was held to a high standard. And again, he is not going to be exempt from sinning against God here. So multiple infractions here. Not believing and trusting in God and obeying what God gave him. And then naturally not demonstrating God's holiness in the sight of the Israelites. This could have been an opportunity for a miracle to speak to an inanimate object. Israel saying, even the rocks obey God, right? So what much more should we, right? Something to that effect, to where they would have more faith in the God that's with them, rather than another potential snare with sorcery or magic or something with Moses. So I think Moses overstepped his bounds a little bit and had to pay the price for it in this situation. So I think what's notable here is at the end of this, God still was able to demonstrate his holiness through the punishment of Moses and Aaron, right? And even though Moses failed here, God was still merciful and provided water here. And I think this points to kind of the bigger theme in the Old Testament. This points to that greater prophet that's coming that Moses spoke about, or the Messianic king through David, or the prophets forecasting the coming one, the suffering servant, the royal priest, right? That human partner that would do the will of God that would do the will of God, and that naturally just points to Jesus. Jesus portrayed himself that way. The Gospels portrayed himself that way. Jesus said even in John 6 that I didn't leave heaven to do the will of me, but the will of the one who sent me. Even though Moses failed, even though Israel kept failing, they went through this cycle over and over throughout the Old Testament. God's promises still never failed. Jesus still came. And God is always faithful to us. So I think that's something to remember here. When we have a problem, when we go to God with our problems, let's stay faithful. Let's pursue obedience with God. And remember that his promises and faithfulness will never fail.